Hello, this is Chuck Gardner, and this is another one of my boring golf tutorials. Today I want to talk about how the hands, wrists, and arms can manipulate the club face and club path, and ways that I have learned to make it easier to control those things predictably. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the wrist action. One of the things that I learned from golf books when I first started out golf, they suggested keeping your lead hand flat in line with the arm. Now, that seems like that's a really good idea because, everything aligns. But what I discovered is that when you extend or flex your wrist in a slapping action to one extreme or the other, you have much better control. If you have both your hands in the middle of the range, there's a lot of variability. They flop around. So you can't really control things as well as if you have your lead wrist either in maxed out extension or maxed out flexion. Now, as it turned out in Hogan's 5 lessons, I learned that Hogan did both of those things in his swing. At the top of his backswing, he had his lead wrist in maxed out extension. That allowed him to very precisely control where the club face was at the top of the backswing. Then, by the time he got down to impact, he had rolled his wrist over. I started doing that for a while until I hit a root with my club and sprained my wrist, so I stopped doing that. I went back to the flat wrist thing, and my consistency suffered. What I realized by experimentation was that this extension method is actually where your wrists are when you get the V's pointing to your armpit or wherever it is they're supposed to be in the swing. And a simple way I discovered how to do that is to start out with the club head at the side with my wrist neutral, grabbing the club, but instead of having the club head pointed straight at the target, I turned it 90 degrees. Grip it 90 degrees, then when I bring the club back, I turn my entire forearm, and what happens is I get my hand in the perfect position. By the time I pull it back to here, I have a perfect lead hand grip. Now, what happens when you do this action, start with the head of the club, turn sideways, and then turn it straight, is you will feel this brachioradialis muscle here stretch. This goes across the top of the elbow. This action here locks the elbow joint. Once I started doing that starting with it flat and then rotating it back to square, I discovered that I no longer had a problem with my lead elbow folding in the backswing. That helped my swing tremendously. Now, having the club In front here, what a lot of people do is they keep the club here and then lean it back, and then they get too much shaft length. They deal off the club, and the clubs really aren't designed for that. The clubs are designed to be gripped like this and then be pulled back to center, so the shaft is more or less vertical and pointing right at your belt buckle. Then your hand is in the position, your lead hand is in the correct position, you've got the brachioradialis muscle stretched in your lead arm, you place your trail hand over the lead hand, and now you have a good grip that will turn the club over equally in both directions. I've talked about that in previous videos. So that is the method that I have adopted to address the club. I don't start with the club with the face square to the target. I start with it anywhere from 90 degrees to 45 degrees closed. However flexible I am that day, that when I twist it and bring it back, it is square to the target. This line, I'm here on the deck so you can see these lines. So that action of getting a strong, they call this a strong grip. I don't like that terminology because strong and weak, what does it mean? This is a supinated extension of the wrist. Pronated. Your pronated is palm down, so you're pronating, rotating it pronated, and you're also putting the wrist into extension. Now, at this point here, you can either go from ulnar deviation to radial deviation. This is the cocking action of the club that creates lag. And it's very difficult if you keep your wrist straight to lag the club up and down. But if you have it in this position here, you will find that it is much easier to waggle the club up and down. So that is a difference between conventional wisdom, how I was taught from books, and how I figured out how to do it a better way. And again, the hints came from Hogan's book, reading 5 lessons and studying his swing videos. All right, now I'm going to turn sideways and show you what this extension and pronation action of the wrist does for the takeaway action. So I set up with a flat wrist with the club face closed almost 90 degrees, bring it back to center and square. Now I'm square to the target, I set my target. Now my wrist is here, and I've talked previously about how if you anchor your forearm and set your 2 fingers, middle fingers here to hold the weight of the club, it becomes a fulcrum. This connects your club to your body, so when you turn your shoulders and hips, everything moves. Now from this position, starting again, closed, twisting it open and bringing it back to the center, I can just waggle the club up and down into the ball, and with just this action, send a golf ball 20, 30 yards. Do it all the time in practice. This is my warm-up. I'll just set my club, bring it into the center, and practice just waggling down and whacking the face of the club into the back of the ball and watch its trajectory. Now, I've talked previously about always using a goal, strategy, technique approach to solving problems. So let's look at the goals of the takeaway. And here's a gem of wisdom that comes from Mo Norman. In one of his videos, Mo Norman said, well, why do you want to swing the club back here? The target's there. You want to keep the club head on the target line. Well, when I hear stuff like that from a guy who's such an intuitive genius like he is, you know, it makes sense. So what I realized when I started doing this action of bringing the club back to center and square and waggling it up, I don't initially try to move the club, lift the club with my arms. What I do is initially just try to waggle it back and bring it back. And what I noticed is that, see how when you waggle it back like this without any hip turn or shoulder turn, the club head comes back, doesn't come much further than one board, about 5-6 inches off the line, and then directly back in line. This method of taking the club away, I discovered, keeps the club head very close to the target line. This process of keeping the hands low, this stretching of the brachioradialis and keeping this arm straight, keeping the trail hand low, connected to be a fulcrum, using the middle fingers to hold the weight of the club and just letting it waggle up, creates enough momentum to get the club started back and pulling the hips and shoulders back all the way to the back top of the backswing. With my arms never really, my trail arm never really disconnecting much from my body. Now, you hear the term connection, connection, connection. You need to have a connected golf swing. Well, for years, I thought that meant you have to pin this against your shoulder and the drill where you put the towel under your lead arm and pit and things like that. Well, that's not really the case. If you use mechanical leverage, starting with getting this lever arm fixed and straight, and this one anchored in, if you have squared back shoulders, this becomes a very firm arm triangle. It's hard for me to move the club back and forth unless I swing it with my shoulders. The up and down action of the club is controlled by letting it rotate around the fulcrum of my middle two fingers in the back hand, and the rotary action is controlled by the rotation of the hips and shoulders. Primarily, it's the hips to get things moving, and then the shoulders follow to bring it to the top. Keeping the shoulders back and squared versus hunching over gives you a more consistent arm triangle. So what I try to do is I start with my shoulders back and straight, bring the club back to the center, and then bring it back, start it up with a little bit of waggle to get the momentum up, bring it up, and at the top of the backswing, my shoulders are rotated, and my club is up where it should be to come back down and release through the ball the same way, and then come up with this arm folded, and this arm now being pulled straight with the club face and toe defining the path up to the top and the finish. So that is how my swing evolved based on my understanding of the mechanics and the physics and the biomechanics of locking the joints. Whenever you're able to lock a joint at a key waypoint in the swing, it's going to be more consistent. So that's it. I hope you find it helpful. And again, thanks for watching.